There are a few factors to why Viktor Yanukovych turned down the European Union trade deal, and you can find this in the Reuters article that you see in the background. I've actually summarized it a little bit, so I'm not going to read all of it, but um I'm going to show you guys a. Well, I'm going to read from a more summarized version of it. So, uh, the main reason to why Yanukovych turned down the European Union trade agreement was mainly due to the makeup of the trade laws with Russia, since Russia is the biggest trade partner of Ukraine, right? Yanukovych's government had estimated that over $160 billion had to be made up for the loss of trade with Russia by the EU. The EU only offered 610 million euros, which is roughly at that time 839 million US dollars, right? According to the Reuters article, an EU source said Ukraine could have been in line to receive at least 19 billion euros in European Union loans and grants over the next 7 years if it had signed a trade and cooperation deal with the European Union and the IMF. The source, however, said that the information never reached the Ukrainians at the negotiations. The year after 2014, the year after, and this was 2014, Ukraine had to cover foreign debt payments of 8 billion US dollars, according to the Yanukovych government finance ministry. At this point, Ukraine was on the brink of bankruptcy, partially due to Moscow blocking the sales of Ukrainian-produced meat, cheese, and some confectionery, and scrapping duty-free quotas on steel pipes. Yanukovych had hopes that the IMF could rescue Ukraine. During the onset of the global financial crisis, the IMF provided Ukraine with a $16.5 billion loan when Tymoshenko was prime minister. In 2010, the IMF had approved a $15.5 billion standby program for the Yanukovych government, dispersing about $3.5 billion before freezing the program in 2011 because Ukraine failed to meet its conditions. The program had expired a year later. The European Union, just like the IMF, was unwilling to grant the sort of loans Yanukovych wanted under a new program. The European Union told Ukraine in a letter dated November 20th that it would not soften its conditions for a new loan and that it would only offer $5 billion. Sorry. The year after, Kiev would have to pay back the same amount as part of of repayments for the earlier $16.5 billion loan. The coming year, according to IMF figures, Kiev should have paid back $3.7 billion. Now, the other reason why Yanukovych didn't want to sign the trade agreement with the European Union was because of the elimination of tariffs, a wage and pension freeze, spending cuts, and the end of gas subsidies. With these consequences, Ukraine turned to the Russian Eurasian Customs Union trade agreement. In November, Yanukovych reneged the European Union deal, which sparked the protests that eventually toppled him from power. And we're going to go through more about the protests, but I want to say that this is the actual reason to why Yanukovych was targeted in a coup. This is why Ukraine, well, part of the reason why they are in the mess that they are in. Obviously, there's a much longer history. Ukraine is a very diverse country. It's a divided country, linguistically, ethnically, and so forth, culturally. And we will go through who some of the key players were in the Maidan protests. So, yes, let's move on. The protests in the Euromaidan didn't have the majority support. Ukraine is a country that is divided linguistically and ethnically, where the Russian-speaking East are in a favor of integration with Russia, while the majority of the protesters at Maidan were from the western parts of Ukraine, an area which has been traditionally ruled by Poland and the Austro-Hungarian Commonwealth. It's also an area which is dominated by anti-Russian nationalism. While the far right was a minority, they were the main vanguard who used violent methods. Although the neo-Nazi movements in the Maidan Square were a minority, they were the most effective fighting force that was around. In fact, the leader of the C-14 movement, Yevhen Karas, admitted this, and we're gonna watch a video when he talks about this. But I wanna stress this fact because a lot of people talk about Putin's comments when he mentioned denazification in his speech, and they say, so what? You know, they got less than 2% of the vote in the latest elections, and they're not a huge, force. Well, actually, they might have gotten the minority vote, less than 2%, but they are integrated in the military. Ukraine is actually the only country in the world that has integrated a far right, not just but many far right battalions and units in their military. Everything from the Tornado Brigade, the 88 Spartan Brigade, the Azov Battalion, you name it. I mean, it's crazy, right? So we're gonna watch a clip when Yevhen Karas, the leader of the C-14, talks about how his group and other far right-wing groups were the most effective fighting force. So check it out.
Стільки зброї не тому, що ми хороші, як нам кажуть, нам допомагає Захід, бо вони хочуть нам блага, тому що ми виконуємо задачі Заходу. Тому що ми єдині, хто готові їх виконувати, бо нам весело, нам прикольно убивати і прикольно воювати. І вони думають, вау, давайте вже подивимося, що це буде. Тому виник цей новий альянс, про який зараз говорять там Туреччина, Польща, Британія, Україна. Тут ми тут флагман. Тому що ми затіяли війну, якої не було вже останніх 60 років. Так от, уявіть собі, скільки в нас зброї, скільки в нас ветеранів. А тепер уявіть, зникає Росія, вона розвалюється. Тобто виникає там 5 Росій, там Недо Росії і так далі. На європейському континенті найбільше. Тільки в Британії, там, здається, більше. Ви розумієте, цей потенціал цих збройних сил, це стане проблемою зразу для всіх, хто зараз нам десь там намагається робити хенькі уколи. І оце от є наша радість і наша печаль. Чому, щоб ви розуміли, чому так все важко? Не тому, що ми, українці, 300 років, наша дупа страждала, чому ж нарешті влада до нас не впаде, ми такі хороші, ми хочемо в Європу. Ні, це величезна, потужна держава, і якщо ми тут прийдемо до влади, це буде і радість, і проблеми для всього світу. Тому це величезна амбітна задача. Ми живемо дуже в класний час, і тому перед нами стоїть надзвичайно амбітна, класна ціль. Не просто стати там частинкою європейської сім'ї, яка вже там розвалилася, а це є, вже йдеться про те, що нові політичні альянси вже глобальні ідеї. Націоналісти якби були там ключовим фактором однозначно і на фронті. Зараз дуже багато є спекуляцій. Ну, нацика вже ж було небагато, там, ЛГБТшники, там, посольства кажуть, скільки там було там нациків? Нациків там було там 10% там, запаяних ідейних. Це ж питання в тому, це може так казати лише Йолоб, який не був на війні, не знає, наскільки оцих 10%, хоча там навіть може дуже менше було, я думаю, націоналістів було хай там навіть 8%, ну наскільки це в пропорції ефективності впливу, наскільки це складало просто галопуючи безкінечну підвищення ефективності. Не було б цих 8%, бо ефективність упала б на 90%. То тут не в числі мова. Так само, як на Майдані. Зараз вже почали ліваки, там фонди Бьоля там, і так далі перераховувати. Ну, націоналістів там було, там, да, вони були впливові. Там. Та які впливові? Не було б націоналістів, все би це от пішло би сразу на гей-парад.
Groups like the Svoboda Party and Right Sector were also the main violent agitators. The Svoboda Party, with its ideologically committed members, managed to keep the protests alive and occupied important key government buildings in both Kiev and the western regions, such as the city of Lvov, where they took over an administration building. This building would be partially controlled by far-right paramilitaries. There, they declared a People's Council that proclaimed Svoboda-dominated local councils and their executive bodies in the region. This further ruled the crisis of legitimacy that ended the Yanukovych ouster. This wasn't limited to the western parts of Ukraine. On January 19th, 2014, the right sector led attacks on police, which was criticized by other opposition leaders. Andrei Parubi, the unofficial commander of the Maidan, founded the Social National Party of Ukraine, which later became Svoboda. By January 2014, the mainstream media outlet NBC admitted that right-wing militia-type toughs are now one of the strongest factions leading Ukraine's protests. A so-called revolution that was meant to be for democracy and liberal values turned into ultranationalist chants from the 1930s with prominent displays of white supremacist symbols, including Confederate flags. External actors have always played an important role in shaping and supporting civil society in Ukraine. Ukrainian scholar Irina Solenenko wrote in 2015, pointing to the European Union and the United States through agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, whose Kiev headquarters were in the same compound as the U.S. Embassy. One can argue that without this external support, which has been the major source of funding for Ukrainian civil society since independence, Ukrainian civil society would not have become what it is. This was the case in 2004 and 5, Orange Revolution, where foreign NGOs changed little about Ukraine's corruption and authoritarianism, but achieved the crucial goal of nudging Ukraine's foreign policy westward, as the Liberal Center for American Progress put it that year. Did Americans meddle in the internal affairs of Ukraine? Yes. The American agents of influence would prefer a different language to describe their activities: democratic assistance, democracy promotion, civil society support, etc. But their work, however, labeled, seeks to influence political change in Ukraine. U.S. officials unhappy with the scuttled European Union deal saw a similar chance in the Maidan protests. Just 2 months before they broke out, the NED's then president, pointing to Yanukovych's European outreach, wrote that the opportunities are considerable and there are important ways Washington could help. In practice, this meant funding groups like the New Citizen, which the Financial Times reported played a big role in getting the protests up and running. Led by a pro-EU opposition figure, journalist Mark Ames discovered the organization had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from U.S. democracy promotion initiatives. All right. Okay. The same far right that had led the charge in toppling Yanukovych, including Parobi, found themselves with plum rolls in the interim government that followed, while the winner of the 2014 snap presidential election, Ukraine's seventh richest man, Petro Poroshenko, had a history of corruption. His interior minister soon incorporated the Azov Regiment, a neo-Nazi militia, into Ukraine's National Guard, with the country now a mecca for far-right extremists around the world who come to learn and get training from Azov, including, ironically, Russian white supremacists who were hounded from their country by Putin. A famous, or infamous, I would rather say, oligarch in Ukraine that has been reported to support some of these militias and later on integrated battalions into the Ukrainian army is Igor Kolomoisky, right? And I'm gonna show you guys here in this Reuters article what I'm talking about. So this is from a Western mainstream news source. This is not Russian propaganda. So many of these paramilitary groups are accused of abusing the citizens they are charged with protecting. Amnesty International has reported that the IDOT battalion, also partially funded by Kolomoisky, committed war crimes including illegal abductions, unlawful detention, robbery, extortion, and even possible executions. Now, he was also the man who partially funded the Azov battalion. Some of Ukraine's private battalions have blackened the country's international reputation with their extremist views. The Azov Battalion, partially funded by Taruta and Kolomoisky, uses the Nazi wolf's angle symbol as its logo, and many of its members openly espouse neo-Nazi anti-Semitic views. The battalion members have spoken about bringing the war to Kiev and said that Ukraine needs a strong dictator to come to power who could shed plenty of blood but unite the nation in the process. So, who is Kolomoisky? Kolomoisky is of Greek Cypriot Jewish Ukrainian descent. So why would a person with Jewish background support or fund these neo-Nazi battalions? Well, it's because he views them as useful idiots, and like the leader of C14 said previously, the ideological right-wing ultranationalist groups who were in Maidan were the most potent, violent force who could get the job done. Now I'm like summarizing what he said. And that's how exactly Kolomoisky views it too. And one of the reasons why Swedish National Socialist movements such as the Nordic Resistance movement, and then previously the Party of Swedes or Swedes, didn't kind of like cut off their alliance, or not alliance, but cooperation or whatever we're going to call it, with some of these, um, ultranationalist groups in Ukraine, such as Svoboda, and why they don't really support the Ukrainian side is because people like Kolomoisky, who are Jewish, right, actually are behind the funding when it comes to some of these movements. Also, as far as I know, Svoboda has started to talk about respecting the rights of minorities, including the Jewish minority, which pisses off the neo-Nazis here in Sweden as well. Some of them, at least, not all of them. I believe it's a bunch of horse shit, obviously. I mean, when you parade with Stefan Bandera and walk around with the organization of the flag of the organization of the Ukrainian insurgency army, who are responsible for the deaths of thousands of Jewish people in Ukraine, I believe this is nothing but, a smokescreen to get into mainstream politics, and later on, when you get power, you sort of implement your policies. So yeah. Just as a side note, I wanted to talk about a little bit who Igor Kolomoisky is. He used to own the Azovstal factory, the steel factory that was taken by the Russians in Mariupol. He owns multiple big businesses, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of these oligarchs in, for example, Ukraine, but also in Russia, they they stole a bunch of state-owned businesses and made it their own, right? They plundered these countries. And but we're going to read a little bit from the Business Insider here. And this is an article. It says here, meet the private army controlled by sacked Ukrainian billionaire Igor Kolomoisky. Billionaire banking tycoon Igor Kolomoisky was appointed governor of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, a region in the east of the country that includes Ukraine's third largest city, in March last year. He had one job: prevent the territory from falling into the hands of pro-Moscow rebels. Although he was a close ally of President Petro Poroshenko's new government in Kiev, neither had the financial nor military clout to achieve that aim. So Kolomoisky decided to build his own private army of volunteers, equipped with heavy weaponry. He paid for all of this from out of his own pockets. The recruits came from Europe, Ukraine and Europe. There are even a couple of Americans. Estimates suggest Kolomoisky could call on over 20,000 troops and reserves. His Dnipro battalion, also known as Dnipro 1, include around 2,000 heavily armed fighters. The unit is reported to have cost the banking billionaire $10 million to set up. They helped play a key role in halting the advance of the Moscow-backed rebels from their strongholds in the neighboring Donetsk and Luhansk. I just want to say that this is from this article is from 2015, so this was before the Russian army had entered Ukraine in 2022. But I just wanted to show you the amount of power this guy has or had, because he is being targeted by, or has been targeted by, a anti-corruption campaign. And it says here in The Guardian, head of Kiev's tax authority accused of multi-million-dollar fraud. One of the unnamed women's 4 homes raided along the home of former Zelensky ally amid president's crackdown on corruption. Zelensky's presidential election was actually funded by, and his acting career, funded by Igor Kolomoisky. So this guy is a very important figure. Volodymyr Zelensky's crackdown on corruption has continued as the woman leading the Kiev tax authority was accused of massive fraud after a raid of one of her 4 homes, and a series of national officials were forced from office. The residence of the businessman, Igor Kolomoisky, a former political ally of Ukraine's president, was also raided as part of an investigation into the suspected evasion of customs duties linked to the Ukrainian oil producer Ukranafta and refiner Ukratatnafta. Hard names. The media empire owned by Kolomoisky, who is already under U.S. sanctions for his alleged involvement in significant corruption, helped popularize Zelensky as an entertainer and then supported his political career. Kolomoisky has denied any wrongdoing. So now you got a little bit of background who this shady individual is. He is definitely a person you should keep an eye out on when we're talking about Ukraine. Despite far-right parties ultimately losing seats in parliament, ultranationalist movements successfully shifted the country's politics to the extreme right, with Poroshenko and other centrists backing measures to marginalize the Russian-speaking, or the speaking of Russian, and glorifying Nazi collaborators. Even so, far-right candidates have entered parliament on non-far-right tickets, and extremists like former Azov commander Andrei Biletsky have taken high-ranking law enforcement positions. While far-right vigilantism spread through the country, Poroshenko himself granted citizenship to a Belarusian neo-Nazi and engaged in some borderline anti-Semitism of his own. And this is what I've talked about before in other videos, that despite the far right being a minority in Ukraine, the fact that they have been integrated into the police force, armed forces, and to a certain extent in the political sphere, that makes them very dangerous. So it doesn't matter if they're a minority. If they have this power and this monopoly on violence, then that is a huge problem, especially with the anti-Russian rhetoric that they espouse, which is very militant, very violent, very aggressive. I mean, they're even brainwashing kids in many parts of Ukraine now, where they have kindergartens and schools where they brainwash kids about, the so-called hero Bandera and the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and basically whitewashing history, Meanwhile, Ukraine's been embroiled in a mini civil war since Maidan. After Putin moved to secure the Crimean naval base from NATO control using the Russian military presence, and a referendum to annex the majority Russian region shortly after Yanukovych's exit, pro-Russian separatists began mobilizing in the country's east, first into protest, then into armed groups. After the interim government sent armed forces to put down the rebellion, Moscow sent its own troops, and the entire region has been a deadly powder keg ever since. Despite his leadership defects, character flaws, Yanukovych had been duly elected in balloting that international observers considered reasonably fair and about the best standard one can hope for outside the mature Western democracies, if we're going to call them that, right? A decent respect for democratic institutions and procedures meant that he ought to be able to serve out his lawful term as president, which would have ended in 2016, but he was ousted before that, that is to say. Neither the domestic opposition nor Washington and its European Union allies behaved in that fashion. Instead, Western leaders made it clear that they supported the efforts of demonstrators to force Yanukovych to reverse course and approve the EU agreement, or, if he would not do so, to remove the president before his term expired. Senator John McCain, the ranking Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee, went to Kiev to show solidarity with the Euromaidan activists. McCain dined with opposition leaders, including members of the ultra-right wing Svoboda Party, and later appeared on stage in Maidan Square during a mass rally. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Svoboda leader Oleg Tiagnibok. But McCain's actions were a model of diplomatic restraint compared to the conduct of Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, as Ukraine's political crisis deepened. Nuland and her subordinates became more brazen in favoring the anti-Yanukovych demonstrators. Nuland noted in a speech to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation on December 13th, 2013, that she had traveled to Ukraine 3 times in the weeks following the start of the demonstrations, visiting the Maidan on December 5th. She handed out cookies to demonstrators and expressed support for their cause. The extent of the Obama administration's meddling in Ukraine's politics was breathtaking. Russian intelligence intercepted and leaked to international media a Nuland telephone call, the so-called FDEU call, that is to say, in which she and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt discussed in detail their preferences for specific personnel in the post-Yanukovych government. The U.S. favored candidates included Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the man who became prime minister once Yanukovych was ousted from power. During the telephone call, Nuland stated enthusiastically that Yats is the guy, right, who would do the best job. Nuland and Pyatt were engaged in such planning at a time when Yanukovych was still Ukraine's lawful president. It was startling to have diplomatic representatives of a foreign country, and a country that routinely touts the need to respect democratic processes and the sovereignty of other nations, to be scheming about removing an elected government and replacing it with official meriting U.S. approval. And people completely talk about that Ukraine is a sovereign country, Ukraine is an independent country. Ukraine lost its independence in 2013 and 14, definitely. And when you have a foreign country that can basically handpick your leaders and ministers and whatever, I really wouldn't call that an independent country. And on top of that, Ukraine has become pretty much a neoliberal project for the elites in Washington and the European Union, where they have privatized the crap out of that country. So, yeah. Washington's conduct not only constituted meddling, it bordered on micromanagement. At one point, Pyatt mentioned the complex dynamic among the 3 principal opposition leaders, Yatsenyuk, Ole Tianyubuk, and Vitaly Klitschko. Both Pyatt and Nuland wanted to keep Tianyubuk and Klitschko, sorry if I butcher these names, out of an interim government. In the former case, they worried about his extremist ties. In the latter, they seem to want him to wait and make a bid for his office on a longer term basis. Newland stated that I don't think Klitsch should go into government. This is quoting here from the call. I don't think it's necessary. She added that Yatsenyuk needed is Klitsch and Tianyobuk on the outside. The two diplomats also were prepared to escalate the already extensive U.S. involvement in Ukraine's political turbulence. Pyatt stated bluntly that we need to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing, the political transition, that's to say. Newland clearly had Vice President Joe Biden in mind for that role, noting that the Vice President's national security advisor was in direct contact with her. Newland related that she told him probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the details to stick. So Biden's willing. Both the Obama administration and most of American news media portrayed the Euromaidan revolution as a spontaneous popular uprising against a corrupt and brutal government. A February 24th, 2014 Washington Post editorial celebrated the Maidan demonstrations and our successful campaign to overthrow Yanukovych. The moves were democratic, as they said. The Washington Post concluded, and Kiev is now controlled by pro-Western parties. It was a grotesque distortion to portray the events in Ukraine as a purely indigenous grassroots popular uprising. The Newland Pyatt telephone conversation and other actions confirmed that the United States was considerably more than a passive observer into the turbulence. Instead, U.S. officials were blatantly meddling in Ukraine. Such conduct was utterly improper. The United States had no right to try and orchestrate political outcomes in another country, especially one on the border of another great power. So people think it's really that strange that Russia reacted, and I personally don't think it's that strange, especially when you get involved in a unconstitutional ouster of an elected government, right? Some say it's a pro-Russian government. I disagree with that. I think Yanukovych was as neutral as he could be, considering that he actually wanted to sign the EU deal, but the fact that it came with all these consequences, he didn't want to do it, and understandably so. That doesn't mean that Yanukovych was a perfect guy. Like what I've said before here is, there was a lot of corruption under his leadership as well. But Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. They're in the same league as Nigeria and the Central African Republic. So that says a lot. Not to say that Western countries aren't corrupt. I always say that Western countries are better at hiding it and rename it. They do it through lobby groups, usually, and stuff like that. So, yeah, Ukraine totally lost its independence in 2013 and 14, in my opinion. So, well, it's not an opinion, really. It's written even in Western media these days. Now, fast forward in 2022, February, Putin delivered in his speech one of the reasons why he felt and the Russian government felt that the situation in the Donbass was getting unacceptable or unbearable for Russia as a whole, but also the population that lives there. So for 8 years, the population of the Russian-speaking population of Donbass have been terrorized by the regime in Kiev and their neo-Nazi battalions, such as the Azov Battalion and the Aidar Battalion, Tornado Battalion, and God knows what other types of fascist military units and battalions that exist in the Ukrainian army. Putin talked about how Russia find it unacceptable for NATO to expand close to its borders. And for 30 years, Russia has appealed to the West not to do that, but they didn't listen. That's one of the reasons. And then you have, obviously, as I talked about previously before, the bombardment and the discrimination of Russian-speaking people in the east and south of the country. And how did Russia justify its invasion, or SMO, special military operation? They declared the Donbass republics, Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, as independent entities. These independent entities then requested Russian military help to protect the civilians in this area, right? But one must remember that Russia, even in the beginning of the special military operation, did not actually seek to want to incorporate these areas into the Russian Federation. So in the beginning of April, there were attempted negotiations between Russia and the Kiev government, and in fact, they were about to accept this peace deal. However, Boris Johnson traveled to Ankara, which the negotiations were held, and told Zelensky not to sign that piece of paper. So essentially, we could have had peace by now if the Zelensky regime and their Western handlers didn't destroy the prospects of that for happening. Russia will never trust the West again because Angela Merkel, François Hollande, and even before Petro Poroshenko, they have all come out and said that the Minsk Accords were nothing but a way to buy time to arm the Ukrainian army to fight the Russians. Russia used Article 51 in the UN Charter as a way to justify its special military operation against, to protect the civilians of Donbass. And the Article 51 talks about fighting in self-defense, I believe, and the preemptive, and that you can also do it in a preemptive strike, basically. So, and that's what the Russians did. They saw an imminent attack coming from the Ukrainian army, and the OSCE, which is here, they actually said that there were over 2,158 ceasefire violations in the evenings of between the evenings of 18th and 20th of February, and the authorities of the LNR and the DPR, they saw the a Ukrainian mass attack or invasion as imminent, and therefore they wanted Russian military assistance to defend them. So that's pretty much the reasons why Russia is involved in Ukraine today. You also have the threat of nuclear weapons, because Zelensky has talked about, putting nuclear weapons in Ukraine if the United States don't protect them and things of that nature. And obviously, these things are unacceptable for Russia. This is a threat to their national security, and I would agree to that. So, yes, these are the main reasons to why Russia carried out its special military operation in Ukraine.